What's up, crawlers? Thanks for joining me here at the Nightmare's Edge. I'm so glad you're here tonight. I truly appreciate it. I have the final two, currently written, parts of the 4-part series written by DarkHeroxx. The stories are entitled, I Saw Hell in the Hospital's East Wing, and I Saw Hell in the Hospital Stairwell. Thanks again, DarkHeroxx, for letting me narrate them. As usual, the links to the stories and socials are going to be listed in the description. Be sure to check them out. Now, sit back, relax, and let me tickle your inner fears. I Saw Hell in the Hospital's East Wing. There's a quote from a man named Thomas Fuller that goes, "Health is not valued until sickness comes." Doesn't this hit pretty deep? But once you start sneezing and coughing a bit, then your whole world goes straight to hell. Your body begins to ache, and you can hardly think straight. All you want to do is close your eyes and beg for the nausea at the end. You fill yourself with medication, anything to try and remedy your ailments. If you think about it for a moment, even if you have the flu, aren't you that much closer to death? Thankfully, we have hospitals and doctors that will combat sickness in order to cure you and prolong your life. That's the goal, isn't it? To preserve ourselves, to prevent death no matter what. But how long should you cling to life even when the end is so near? The ticking of the clock was pounding in my ears as I just sat there one night. I was trying my hardest to keep composed in this place, but I could feel it slowly eating away at me. The past incidents were flashing in my mind. The man thing in the hallway. Whatever the fuck I saw sucking the life out of poor Dorothy. What unsettled me was the fact that I was seeing these things. I get hearing these stories, but why? Why am I seeing these things? Thankfully, I was settling into the night at the East Wing's second floor, the dialysis unit. I was happy because surprisingly, there were no scary stories involving that floor. Thank God, but unfortunately, that didn't exactly help me too much. The dialysis unit was a really dreary place for me, even without having stories to fuel my mind with horrors. The area was dimly lit. The people who were admitted here were practically on death's door, and the smell was just unpleasant with the odor of chemicals wafting through the air. That makes me sound like a monster, but that's just how it is. I don't want to offend anyone. These people that are on dialysis are clinging so desperately to life. They want to live just like everyone else. We're trying to help them as much as we can. It's not really a pleasant process for anyone, but it's necessary for their recovery to filter out the toxins of their body. Our unit has 5 beds and they were each filled. There were a couple of other nurses with me to help monitor the patients, and I can't tell you how happy that made me. With the past 2 incidents, I didn't want to be alone in this place at all. We were gossiping about some of the doctors, and it was successfully passing the time. I was starting to feel a bit at ease. Again, there weren't any stories involving this area. I was looking forward to experiencing a completely normal night. During the shift, my head started to throb and my eyes began to sting. Nights are never easy, so I assumed I just needed a little pick-me-up. There was a coffee machine nearby, so I went to grab a quick cup to get me through the shift. As I walked down the aisle towards the exit, I noticed one of the patients was awake. He was in his mid-40s. His face was pale and gaunt with dark circles around his eyes. He was just staring at me, but with his eyes, he seemed so angry. I slowed down to see if he needed anything. I asked to see if there was anything I could do for him. He just continued to stare at me. I wanted to make him as comfortable as possible, so I made sure everything was running okay. The whole time I was there, he just kept on staring at me silently. It was as if his eyes were burning holes through me. After I made sure everything was running properly, I just left him alone. As I walked away, I could still feel him looking at me. I stood in front of the old machine, the styrofoam cup slowly filling with black coffee. I tried to shake the uncomfortable feeling that the patient had given me. The look in his eyes of pure anger and disgust. if looks could kill. I grabbed my cup and sipped at it. Lukewarm, but the caffeine was what I needed. My head wasn't throbbing as badly, but my eyes. It was as if something was stinking the back of my eyeballs. I made my way back to the dialysis unit with coffee in hand. I opened the door and saw the other nurses were gathered at the bed where the man was. I rushed over to see what was happening. I could hear his heart monitor going off like crazy. When I made it to the bed, I dropped my coffee at what I saw. The nurses turned to look at me, their faces covered in confusion as I slowly stepped backwards. The man in the bed continued to glare at me, but not only that, he was being held down by a decayed fleshed hand. The arms were coming from the ground and they stretched up onto the bed. They were covering him from head to toe, hands with peeling putrid skin gripped tightly onto his body. One of the nurses was tending to him while the others asked what was wrong, but I couldn't utter a word. Could they not see what was happening to that man? I felt my body begin to sink, and as I looked down, I saw my feet being slowly submerged by the floor. I lifted my feet and stepped down to feel a disgusting squish underneath me. It was as if I was stepping on decayed meat. The smell was absolutely wretched. The air was filled with a nauseating stench of rot. It was like the ground was trying to swallow me whole as I lifted my legs out. Suddenly, the nurses started to rush to the other beds, but they were completely unaffected by the scene around me. I looked at the other 4 patients who were all coding. I composed myself and tried to run towards another patient, an older man. I say run, but it was like my legs were sinking with each step. When I finally got to the other patients, I could see those damn arms stretching from the ground. Multiple hands were gripping onto the poor man. They were crashing. I had to do my job. I had to help them. The hands were gripping tighter and tighter onto them while I tried my best to stabilize them. The others started to scream along with them. I looked over to the other nurses and they were just as alarmed as I was, but we had to do our jobs. I continued to try and help the man in front of me. The hands began to loosen their hold on the man. I thought things were going to be okay, but the rotten hands began to grab onto me. I held in my yell of terror as I continued to help my patient. I felt my body grow heavy as more and more hands began to grip onto me. I looked around to see the other patients were quietening down. I glanced onto my body to see countless hands tightly gripping me. They were pulling me down towards the floor. I tried my best to continue to help the patient, but I couldn't push through anymore. I collapsed onto the floor. The other nurses rushed towards me. One was helping the man while the others were checking to see if I was okay. They couldn't see anything that was happening. They couldn't see my body being pinned down on the floor by dead hands. They couldn't see the hands wrap around my throat, pulling me down into the floor made of rotten meat. They tried to lift me up, but they didn't have the strength to overpower the hands gripping onto me. That was when I let out a blood-chilling scream. It was the only thing I could do as I was stuck, frozen in place. I'm not a religious person, but I prayed for someone to come and help me. I could feel my life being drained as the pressure on my arms made it feel like my bones would snap. Minutes had passed, but it felt like an eternity. I was in so much pain that at this point, I just wanted it to end. I was finally able to black out at some point. I woke up in a hospital bed, and I looked over to see one of the nurses I was working with at my bedside. She jumped up when she saw me awake and ran to get a doctor for me. When the doctor came, we talked about what happened. I couldn't tell him what I saw. I'd sound like I'd gone insane. So I told him some fake symptoms that I felt, so they brushed it off as just stress. He suggested I take a few days off and maybe to see a therapist, so I agreed. Before the doctor left, he crept close and whispered to me. He asked if everything was okay at home. I was confused, but I assured him everything was okay. He gave me a puzzled look and told me to come to him if I needed anything at all. Now I was confused, but maybe he was just being really nice. A few hours later, I was finally able to get home. When I got to my apartment, I walked straight into my bathroom. The memory of those disgusting hands and the rotten floor filled my head. The smell was the worst part. That putrid smell I can't get out of my nose. So I stripped down and turned on the shower to hopefully wash it away, That was when I caught a glimpse of my naked body in the mirror. All over my bare flesh were bruises, dark purple bruises in the shape of fingertips and hands. I saw hell in the hospital stairwell. They say time heals all wounds, but mine feel like they are getting worse the longer I stay at this place. It's been a few weeks since my last post, and lo and behold, I'm still here. I know you people must think I'm absolutely crazy for staying. I keep finding myself getting ready for the next shift, waiting for another monster to appear around the corner. Why am I the only one that's seeing them? I ask myself that every time I get into my car and drive towards the hospital. What is driving me further into this madness? Seeing these horrible things makes me want to make sure that no one else that comes to the hospital becomes another lost soul or another horror story. Perhaps those are just pretty words to disguise my insatiable curiosity. I want to make a difference. I want to do something, but I'm slowly losing the strength to go on. The last few incidents have rocked me to my core, but something happened recently that almost made me lose faith in everything. It was just a few weeks ago. I was pulling into the parking lot at the hospital when I noticed a few cop cars pulled up close to the entrance. When I got closer, I could hear a man wailing at the top of his lungs from inside the lobby. I cautiously stepped forward to see a few police officers trying to hold down a man. He was a stocky, middle-aged white man with thinning hair, and his face was covered in tears. A couple officers were at the side trying to calm the man down. I looked over to see a doctor sitting on the ground covering an eye that was forming a bruise. A few minutes passed until the police were able to finally calm the man down. I was getting late for my shift and there was nothing I could do for them. That night, the hospital was abuzz with what had happened, and it was much worse than I thought. It took a while to sift through what was real and what was just gossip. Apparently, there was an accident not long before I got there. We had a teenage patient in our care named Danielle, a beautiful young woman with long brunette hair, a glowing smile, and such a bright personality. She was often in and out of the hospital due to some minor complications. Daniela was 8 months pregnant, and it was really taking a toll on her physically. I've met her a couple times. Though she was in pain, she always kept a sunny disposition. We would occasionally chat. She would express her worries about being a young mother, her future, and things at home. Things weren't going well with her and her boyfriend. They often argued with each other and their parents couldn't help but chime in. She absolutely loved her boyfriend, but at the end of the day, they were still children. There wasn't much she could do but go through with the pregnancy and prepare herself to be a mother. Earlier that afternoon, just before I got there, she had lost her life. That afternoon, she complained that her feet were aching and insisted that she take a walk. That wasn't an odd request at all, so she was allowed to do so. About 10 minutes or so had passed when they noticed she was no longer walking through the hallway. They checked her room to find it empty and immediately split up to look for her. One of the nurses went into the stairwell about 20 minutes afterward and found her body at the bottom of the set of stairs. Daniela and her baby were both gone. The authorities and her family was notified of the incident. Her father didn't take it well. Of course he didn't take this news well. He was sad and angry and took it out on the nearest doctor. That was when I came in at the tail end of the incident. The officers questioned everyone that was working at the time and came to the conclusion that she had ended her own life. That's what got to me. She didn't seem like the person that would do that, but then again, no one ever really knows. For a while, there was an oppressive air that fell upon the place. A lot of nurses blamed themselves for not keeping a better eye on her. There wasn't much else we could do. Unfortunately, death is commonplace at the hospital. So we're forced to pick up the pieces and move on to the next person in need of help. A few days after everything happened, that's when the story started to circulate. Eventually, many of the staff refused to go towards the stairwell. It started off as a simple superstition, someone just died there kind of thing. Then it turned into people feeling things on their shoulders, cold chills running down their spine, and hearing noises akin to crying. Slowly but surely, the stories came that the stairwell had become haunted, another ghost story to add to the place. I did my best to avoid the stairs. We had elevators, so the likelihood of me using them was low. I knew that if I were to go to those stairs, I would regret it. As I continued my night shifts, something at the back of my brain was scratching at me. I kept thinking of Danielle. Even though we only talked a few times, she was a life that was here. I wanted to know if there was anything I could do for her if she was trapped here. Curiosity was slowly taking the best of me. Simple curiosity that of course kills the cat. We were having a pretty slow night, and it was a couple more hours until my shift would end. I did something incredibly stupid. I made my way towards the wing where it happened, got into the elevator, and took it down to the floor where she was. I stepped through the door onto the stairwell, and I stood there at the top of the steps. It was so quiet that I could hear my breath echo down the stairs. I just stood there staring down those hard steps as I imagined, not Daniela, but myself tumbling down them. I grabbed the railing and closed my eyes, wondering what the hell I was even doing here. I stood there for a few moments, reminiscing the brief conversations I've had with Danielle. She would talk about how excited she was to have a little boy, so afraid of being alone if her boyfriend didn't stay. I took a deep breath as I felt a tear roll down my cheek. Danielle was so young. Goosebumps started to form on my skin as a sudden burst of cold air circled me. That's when I realized I was no longer alone. My eyes were still closed, but I could hear something at the bottom of the steps below me. It was heavy and labored breathing. Each inhale had a faint bubbling to it, and each exhale I could hear a low crack like something was breaking. My body began to tremble. I gripped onto the railing to steady myself. I could hear it move now. It was making its way up. I could hear the wet slaps hitting the steps, followed by a disgusting crunch. I didn't want to open my eyes. I stood there saying to myself, "Don't look, don't look, don't look." It was getting closer and closer. I took one deep, shaky breath and opened my eyes to see nothing. Relief washed over me. I slowly sat down at the top of the steps and let out a sigh. I leaned onto the rails. The metal was cold on top of my head. A chuckle escaped my lips as I thought of how I was overreacting. How everyone was afraid of some ghost on the stairs. My chuckle soon turned into tears. I didn't know what I was expecting. A few more minutes had passed. I wiped my face and prepared myself to finish the rest of my shift until something brushed against me. I kicked my leg and jumped up. It felt like a cockroach had run across my ankle. I looked down to see something past the railing. A hint of brown quickly going beyond my view. I slowly peeked over the edge. My jaw dropped and I let out a scream that filled the space around me, or rather, us. She was hanging onto the side of the rail almost underneath the stairs I was on. All I could see was a blood-spattered hospital gown and that familiar, long brunette hair, except it was matted and dirty. "Danielle?" I was finally able to utter, my throat sore from screaming. I heard her neck creak and snap as she turned her head up towards me. Her once beautiful smile was completely destroyed. Her lower jaw was barely hanging onto her face. What was left of her teeth were yellowed and bloodied. She was hanging there with bones jutting out of her fingers as she held onto the steps I was on. I backed up slowly as she climbed over the rail, her body slamming onto the bottom of the steps. My right hand was on the handle that led to the hallway. I pulled, but the door wouldn't fucking budge. I turned my full attention onto the door and began to frantically pull at it. I started banging my fist onto it, hoping someone would hear me. I looked through the small glass window to the door to see the hallway with nurses walking back and forth. "Help me!" I screamed, but no one paid any heed to my cries. I looked down to look at Danielle. She was standing there at the bottom of the stairs. Her neck was bent in an L shape and her legs were bent in such an inhuman way. Her hair was covering her face. She was looking down onto her stomach. The lights flickered around us. I continued to try to open the door, but still it wasn't moving an inch. That was when I heard something rip. Fabric was being torn apart. I looked back down to see her ripping her gown open to reveal her stomach. I cried as I saw that it was flat and sunken on one side. I stood there completely frozen. I was stuck, and all I could do was witness this horrific scene. Danielle, what was left of Danielle, started to dig her fingertips into her belly. The noise that came out was a nauseating squish and tearing. My mouth hung open. I wanted to scream, but nothing would come out of me. She started to open herself up, wider and wider. Then was a faint thud. I looked beneath her to see that it was still attached to her by a dry, rope-like umbilical cord. A small, misshapen form of what looked like a baby. It just lay there, parts of its body flattened, a dry, bloody mess that writhed on the floor. A noise erupted from the baby, a high-pitched chittering like thousands of maggots clamoring atop of one another. Please, please stop, let me go, I shouted at Danielle, but she started to crawl up the stairs. Like a wounded animal, she was crawling up the stairs towards me, the baby dragging behind her. I was desperate and pushed my body against the door, but again, nothing. I refused to let her get to me, so I bolted up the stairs. I ran and ran up, the stairwell spiraling upwards. I looked down and I thought she was chasing me, but as I looked, I saw I wasn't going anywhere at all. It was futile. No matter how many steps I ran up, the distance between us didn't grow. She was now at my feet, her decaying hands reaching out towards me. I couldn't do anything else but let her take me. I felt her cold hands touch me through the pant legs of my scrubs. My skin was burning from the cold. I closed my eyes, ready for her to pull me down the stairs. That's when I saw something. Through the darkness of my closed eyes, I saw visions of something. A couple of weeks ago, Danielle was atop these very steps, alive and well. I was looking at her as if I was watching a movie. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a person wearing a black hoodie and jeans. I couldn't see the person's face very well. I couldn't hear anything, but from the looks of it, things weren't going well. Danielle was yelling at the person. Her eyes were red and puffy from sobbing. She kept on gesturing towards her full and pregnant belly, and she put a hand on the other person's shoulder. They brushed her aside, and she stood there with a look of pure pain plastered onto her face. She clasped her hands together in a pleading way. Then, they pushed her down the stairs. I stood in awe as I saw her body roll down the stairs and slam onto the floor below. My head started to ache, and a ringing filled my ears that was so loud, I thought my brain was going to erupt. I looked down onto my ankle, and Danielle, she was gone. I was alone again, standing at the top of those damn stairs. I pulled the handle to the door, and sure enough, it opened like normal. I ran to the bathrooms and immediately vomited into a nearby sink. I couldn't help myself from shaking. I couldn't stop the crying. I had to pick myself up and carry the scraps around. I needed to stay composed, unless everyone who doesn't think I'm crazy changed their minds. I had to continue the shift, and when I finally got home and crashed onto my carpeted floor, I just laid there. A few days later, there was word that there was foul play involved in Danielle's death. Her boyfriend snuck into the hospital. They talked, argued, and he simply pushed her down. His statement was that he couldn't live with himself. He kept on hearing the baby cry in his sleep. After hearing that, I couldn't help but laugh. I still hear the baby too. I love these stories so much. Such an amazing job by Dark Hero. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I do. Again, check the description for links to Dark Hero's stories and socials. But until next time, remember, just because you couldn't see it, doesn't mean it wasn't watching you.